All right. Uh, cool. Let's get started. So thank you all for being here with me. What I was hoping to do was share a little bit of background and information and experience that I've had with problem framing. It's been a tool that that I was really super uncomfortable with when I first discovered what it was all about and read about it and learned about it, and started implementing and facilitating these sessions. And thanks, Joe. And hey, Beth. Thanks. Oh, Kim and Beth. Wow, the duo. So it's been quite a journey, and I've gotten a lot of success. Once I've gotten familiar with it, I've had a lot of success with it. So I wanted to start by just framing means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and the way that I use it, and the structure in which I use it, and the time in my process, and the arc of which I use it changes even for me from project to project, and depending on the team I'm going into and the work that I'm doing. And that, of course, it totally changes for the work that you're doing. So I thought I would just back up and start with my story, New Haircut story, and just to ease you into how we discovered framing. And hopefully that's a little bit of context about how you might take it into the work that you're doing. So I really like this visual. It came from Gartner. I borrow and or steal lots of things like this, especially good visuals. I like this visual because it tells this story. A lot of folks on this call and in the space of innovation come from the world of product, or design or innovation or research. Of course, innovation should and could apply to folks outside of those fields, people that are working in marketing and sales and operations and finance. Those groups actually tend to be invited into innovation practices instead of having their own process and methods. So I'm really excited that folks outside of, as much as I love that us product people use innovation, I'm really excited that folks outside of it are starting to look at it more and more. So if you are in those fields, though, you've probably seen visuals that look like this, arrows and circles and things like that. It tells a pretty interesting story. And it actually relates very precisely to my story, a New Haircut story, with a little bit of a twist. In fact, it kind of goes backwards. So in fact, if you don't know New Haircut story, we were a product design and development studio. We opened up 10 years ago. And we started with the idea. I was a software engineer that spent years at Accenture and writing code. And eventually I became a product manager. And so I took all of that information and experience as an engineer and a product manager and started New Haircut. But like most human beings, most teams, organizations, I also started at the end. And throughout this journey, I always thought I was at the starting point. And so when I got going, I thought that the spec and me building that small piece of code and testing it, I thought that was the starting point. And as I progressed along my career, when I left Accenture, I joined a startup in New York City. And the charge that came to me, I was the director of project management. And the charge that the CEO gave to me was to transform the company to be agile. And this is early 2000s. So the agile charter had been out, right, for many years before, but a lot of organizations weren't even considering it or looking at it. So I didn't know really where to start except to go out and buy a whole bunch of Post-its and markers and hold these stand-ups and basically piss everybody off. But it was a new way of doing things. So it was the first time that I started to get a feel for change management and basically indoctrinating new ways of people to come together and share ideas and kind of co-create. And I took those ideas and experiences into New Haircut. And that's also the way that, thanks, John. That's also the way that we operated for the first several years. The problem was that we kept building stuff that nobody cared about. We would build things, our own internal products as a company that was hired by other companies to build their products, their ideas. We would kind of take in their ideas, ask questions, and then we would just roll up our sleeves and start building stuff. And what we were excited about is that we were able to shrink corporate timelines from, our typical corporate timelines of 18 to 24 months. We were able to use what we knew about Agile to do things in 3 or 4 months, which is great. It's exciting. it still led to products and solving problems that no one seemed to really care too much about. Or we solved it in a way that it was weird and confusing, or their solutions that they were already embedded in using, how they were using it was too much to pull them away and pull them into a new experience. So what we learned is that we kind of fell backwards into this model of lean and MVPs. We realized that just by shrinking our timelines and thinking about putting products and services in consumers and users' hands in 3 or 4 months and really beginning the learning process at that point, we learned that that was what lean development was all about. But what we also learned was that if you've spent 3 months building something, the team becomes crazy emotionally attached to those ideas. Even when I run a design sprint, by the end of the sprint, after 3 or 4 days, everybody is just kind of like barreling down that path of running with the ideas that we came up with in the sprint. So if we waited 3 or 4 months to take these ideas and put them out into the market, basically became impossible for us to back away from those ideas, to pivot. The idea of pivoting, it sounds nice, it sounds very simple, but it's actually really hard, because you've spent 3 or 4 months, you've spent a decent amount of money, time, people's energy, and emotional attachment to a specific set of ideas, and pivoting those ideas at that point becomes really challenging. And then on top of it, you still haven't really vetted that you're solving the right problem, an important problem. So at the end of 2015, we discovered for ourselves design thinking, and it came in this really nicely packaged bite-size container called a design sprint, which I call design sprints a recipe of design thinking. And so we started really with nothing left to lose. Sounds pretty dire, but we really wanted to change how work was happening inside New Haircut. We started running our own sprints. And at the time, there was just a website. The book hadn't been published yet. So we took what we learned, started running sprints, and we found ourselves in this earlier part of the umbrella of product design and product development, which uses design thinking to build empathy of the people that you're solving problems for, and to iterate and prototype different solutions to those. So we became obsessed and fell head over heels in love with design sprints. What I want to make sure of is that problem framing does not need to lead to a design sprint. They're not joined at the hip. It's just that at that point, we were embedded in using design sprints and using them quite furiously. And so that became our newest starting point. What happened with us, though, is that we learned through a couple failures, so a couple failed sprints, we learned that there's a difference between prototyping and testing ideas and testing that solution space versus the problem space. And if you guys come from the design world, there's this notion of the double diamond, which talks about really understanding the problem that you're solving before you get into any sort of solution space. And a design sprint does sit at the very early stage of the solution phase. So again, even after years and years, 20 years in technology, and now 6 or 7 years into New Haircut, when we found design sprints, we also had thought we had found this perfect starting point. And what we learned was that even in the sprint itself, you're there to solve a problem, but the sprint can't tell you if you're solving the right problem. So with a little bit of falling on our face a few times, sometimes the sprints work, but sometimes we realized that we were kind of like barking up a tree that nobody cared about. So we started unpacking the problem definition and sort of the problem validation from our sprints. We worked with Jim Kalbach. If you haven't read his book, Mapping Experiences, so we worked with Jim a little bit to understand how to pull specifically the map out of the understand phase of the sprint. And we'd made just trial and error over the course of years. We started to remove a lot of the problem definition from our sprints. We also learned that research is the important thing. So Erica Hall has a great book, Just Enough Research, a great read. So we learned how and when to apply the research, what to bring into our sessions. And really we started to unpack all of these things so that it became a bit more modularized, because it's tempting to say, like, let's just get people in a room. We're going to do, it's only a week. We're going to, you know, fly people in and we're going to run a sprint. But there's a big jeopardy that you don't have the right people in the room, that you're wasting time on a problem that you could have, in a half a day or a day or a little bit of research, realized that the problem wasn't that important to be solved. And then you could pivot way early in the process to run a sprint on something that's much more impactful. In the last webinar I did, people asked if there were books that I've read. Not so much books, a lot of articles, a lot of videos. This one's great. You can take a screenshot of this. Patrick Whitney talks about the value of abstracting problems. In his example, I won't spoil it, but in his example, he uses Apple and the iTunes store from way back in the day. And he talks about how Apple looked at the idea of solving the problem of bringing portable music to people. So they looked at the whole ecosystem and the actual problems people had around listening to music portably, sharing music, and things like that. It's a great video, 7 minutes long, so it's totally worth it. So as we realized what we were doing, we discovered, of course, a little bit by accident, that we were doing problem framing. And so we didn't invent framing at all. It's a concept that's been out for decades. What we did do is we started to stitch together things that worked, that took a lot of the principles of design thinking, the way that people come together and hold conversations and hold space and share ideas, to visualize those ideas. And what we did is we created our own recipe of framing, with two constituents in mind. One is actually the first in order, is the company. So really making sure that from a strategic standpoint, that the ideas that we're looking at and the landscape of opportunities that we're thinking about solving or learning more, at least within a framing session and later within a sprint or what follows, is important and ties back to some strategic initiative. Because otherwise, the stakeholder swoop in, right? The executive leader kind of comes into the process and says, this isn't important, you guys should be focused over here. So really important that we spend time getting familiar with what's important to the company. And then of course, bringing in the voice of the user, of the customer, and then bringing those two together to find things that are interesting to the company, potentially things that a field or a customer segment that they're excited about, maybe they have a little bit of existing opportunities within, and then within that, finding the user pain points that are most hairy, most aggressive, most challenging, because in that space, you have some really nice opportunities to improve or innovate. And so what our process started to unfold into, this is obviously a simplified version. It's linear. None of this stuff is ever linear, of course, but basically we took framing and we put it before things that we would do, like prototyping, rapid prototyping, sometimes things that would precede a design sprint like this. And so we kind of just bucket it into this part called pre-sprint. And I'm going to share a little bit I'm going to unpack that a little bit later. And this is what we wound up creating. Definitely didn't happen overnight. We road tested a whole bunch. We went out and tested it in different markets, different end products and services that we were trying to, changed it, broke it down, rebuilt it time and time again. I wrote a series of articles on framing. I think it's almost that series is almost 2 years old. Since then, we've rebuilt a lot of it just from trial and error. But this is more or less the 8 steps that we tend to take. This is meant to be consumed or facilitated within the course of a single business day. And because who tends to be in these sessions are folks that it might be the core sprint team, but it tends to be people that are a little bit more senior, a little bit more strategic, that have a broader view of the vision of where they want things to go and the opportunities that they want the group to focus on for the next 6 or 12 months. So we did it, we designed it to fit within the course of a day. Sometimes we stop and we pause, and I'll talk more about that, but it's meant to fit in a day so that you can have those people's attentions. And even that is sometimes a lot to ask for. Getting people to spend 2 hours is sometimes a lot versus this is about an 8-hour process. But you'll see at the bottom, the first 4 steps are all about the business context and making sure that we're aligned with a strategic initiative of the company. Then we shift into the user space, and then we end with, again, with the help of some of the things we learned in working with Jim, is mapping those things together so that we can find sort of that overlay of interesting opportunities. And then we end, and I always find this funny when I say it, but after 8 hours of research and deliberating and mapping and all these tools that we use and all these conversations, we end the session with a sentence. Because the reason that a lot of our sprints failed is because there was total ambiguity on what we were there to solve. So who had the problem? Was it really important? How are they solving it today? How are we going to even measure success? Should we keep going? And just that, the clarity of the message of the challenge that we were trying to figure out and learn more about in sprints, in the parts that followed, was often unclear. The person that wrote the brief or the spec or whatever kind of preceded a workshop like this, it was clear to them. But of course, humans are complex and we have our own mental models. So that ambiguity caused a lot of problems. So the main goal of framing was to bring clarity to the problem that we were trying to learn more about. So what I wanted to do today, we don't have time to go through all 8 steps, but what I wanted to do is just introduce you to step 1 of our process, which I call Smart Sailboat. I'll tell you what that is. And you can see up at the top, the target here is on the business. And as we shift into steps 5 and 6, we shift into the user, and 7 and 8 is that marriage between the two. So the reason that we start with problem discovery and using this activity called a Smart Sailboat is because without it, how we tend to start a session. So actually, as somebody that receives requests to go and help groups, what tends to happen is they say, I'll receive an email like, we're excited to run a sprint. We've got a whole bunch of things in the roadmap. Which one should we choose? And before we got into the world of framing, I really didn't have a good way to help them. I'd say, well, you just pick one and we'll run a sprint on it. And of course, that's not really helpful. And so what they would tend to do is kind of pick one from the top of the list. If they were an executive sponsor, tend to be something that they were connected with, something that they felt was the most important thing to be solved. And that, of course, invites a lot of bias because that's the thing that their eyes are set on. That's where their intention is. But there could be other things that are more important to the company, more important to the customer segment that they're trying to serve. The other thing that we saw happen is that people would come in armed with spreadsheets and surveys. A lot of the time the surveys were created with questions that were totally biased and really uninformed. So they would just throw numbers and we would kind of zoom in on one particular problem set. So what we wanted to do with the first entry point into our framing session is give the group who needs to be informed about the total space, give the group a chance to have a discussion about the landscape of opportunities that they might want to explore more. So just to kind of put them all up to have a visual of all the different opportunities or problems, and I'll use those interchangeably, all the different problems that they're interested in the company spending more time on and solving. So the sailboat, also not a new activity. The sailboat is traditionally done, it looks something like this. You start by talking about the wind. These are the things that have been pushing the company forward in recent past, things that are going well for the company, successes, some wins. And that is a design thinking thing to start off on the positive, get the group kind of acclimated. It's the first activity of the day. So getting that conversation, getting people's walls down, you start off on the positive, talk about things that are pushing the company forward. And then you shift into anchors, which are things that have been holding us back as a team, as an organization, as a company, in the industry. What are things that if we were to solve them and work on them today, tomorrow they could turn into our win? This is a great visual activity to do, to have this kind of discussion. The only reason I made a change to it is because a lot of the time the questions I'd get would be, well, are we talking about a specific problem space that we should be focused on? Is this total blue sky or greenfield? I'm never sure which one of those to use, so I just always say them both. Should we be talking about the total landscape within our industry? And as an outside consultant, I really didn't know how to navigate that discussion. I would just tell them, well, what does the company executives think? What is innovate? How do you define innovation inside the company? And without that, it felt like a rough start. It felt like the group wasn't entirely sure, and what that resulted in was wind and problems that were really kind of apples and oranges. Some folks would be talking about total landscape, some would be like zoomed way into a specific space that they had experience within. So I made a couple changes to the Sailboat activity. What I do is I start with, keeping to the Sailboat theme, I start the group by talking about the harbor. So the question that I ask them is, where are we headed as a group? What's our destination? Where do we want to be in 6 to 12 months? What's exciting to us? And then we can also flip that on its head to say, what do we not want to be focused on? So this is where a little bit of scoping can come into the discussion. And what that does is it really helps, that constraint really helps the group focus, so that as they talk about the wind next and the anchors after that, they have a lot more clarity and focus, that they can have those discussions and really generate some ideas. The only other thing I added to this was the notion of icebergs. So what I also realized is that by talking about anchors, these are things that you've already kind of, it's already there today or in your recent past. And what's also important is to think about the things that are a little bit up ahead, the things that we can see coming. This might be regulations that are coming down, or policy, or M&A deals that you know are coming either inside your company or in the industry overall. Just things that should be on our radar, that we need to be thinking about to help guide it helps guide some of the questions we have, but also, is this the right opportunity that we should be focused on today, given our anchors and icebergs? And that's this evolved Sailboat activity that I just call a smart sailboat. It's done a lot of great. And so where this goes from here is, now what you're looking at is you have this landscape of problems or opportunities, your anchors and icebergs, and you have a harbor or a destination where you're hoping to get by the end of the day, at the end of the month or quarter or year. And where you go from here is, we spend the next several activities in framing going from many opportunities down to one, because the goal of framing is to get that top or most important next problem that you want to learn more about and potentially solve. So it's nice that you start here. The group is all involved and engaged and invested, and now there's this visualized ecosystem of opportunities. And where we go from here is, the next step is I use a framework called the Kinevin. What we've done is taken that framework and the sense-making model that the Kinevin is, and we've applied it to this landscape of problems, so that you could begin to plot them in the different quadrants based on their complexity. Because if your innovation goals or your goals of running the session are incremental improvements, then you might tackle some of the more simple problems. But if you're going for those big moonshots, if you're going for those really complex and hairy problems, then you might want to tackle those big complex problems. So anyway, that's how we transition from problem discovery to the Kinevin I call step 2 is problem sensing. And then we move into a 2x2, and kind of like I mentioned, the point of that is to get to the point where the group has identified this one really exciting, hairy, challenging problem that they want to tackle. And then we take that problem and run it through the rest of the workshop. Yes, that is it. Thank you. So this is what framing looks like. If you've facilitated or you're planning on facilitating, this is how I tend to plan my time. We tend to think of framing as this contained workshop. I always struggle with what to call it, a session, a workshop, I'm not sure. But it's actually like everything else, you need to do some stuff to prepare yourself, to get the team organized, and then to actually execute and facilitate the day's activities. So it's a series of things that you should be thinking about. Let me break it down. So like any process, like any time that you're going to get a group of people together, I think it's always really important to do at least a little bit of research, just so you can bring those insights into the team. You are organizing a group of people that are supposed to be informed and experts in the company, in the industry, in the sort of the overall, if there is a focus in that problem space. So yes, there is intelligence and experience in the room, super important, but bringing in anything you can about the market, the landscape, the industries, that you can into the process to seed that into the group, important and a great idea. So what I tend to do is do that gathering of research. If I go out and conduct my own research, or I work with a team that is out doing field research or talking to folks, scripting, interviewing, whether it's in person, in the field, or virtual, I tend to do that about 1 to 3 weeks in advance, just so that I can organize myself, make sure I've got the right people in the room to be joining us during the framing session itself. What I also do, because my work is becoming more and more virtualized, I do a lot of this stuff as much as I like to do the work in person, because doing this work sitting elbow to elbow with folks is still better. It's still more powerful. There are times when doing it virtual actually lets people bring their walls down a little bit more and share. But the point is that some of my work, I do this in person, some of it is virtually. So when I talk about pre-work, what I'm talking about is not only my time of organizing the research, getting the right people to go in the room, reserving the space, doing all the sort of logistical planning, but it's also bringing that information back and being in front of the group weeks in advance, so that they have their time, they can go through the research, they can ask questions, they can make sure that they should be in the session, or help you to find the right people that should be there. But then there's also a part of pre-work that I give the team to do, and that it varies depending. So if we're doing it virtualized and I'm introducing new tools like Mural or Miro, then I do the pre-work inside of those tools as a way to not only meet the team and start the collaboration process, but also get used to the tools as well. If we're doing it in person, then I make sure that they've put their pre-work together, and that becomes the kickoff to the actual workshop itself. So there's pre-work for me to do, pre-work for the team to read and review, and then there's always a pre-work activity just to get the group acclimated. And the research box is there. It follows me throughout the process. So as I'm organizing, getting people involved, I'm talking with them. I tend to schedule one-on-ones with everyone that I know is going to be in the session, to hear what they're hoping to get out of it, what they're worried about, some of their concerns, and then putting that back into the stuff that I share back with the team. And the workshop itself, like I mentioned at the start, is intended to be facilitated in the span of about 8 hours. When you're getting started, you might need to break it down and do it in 2 chunks, so maybe 2 4-hour sessions or 2 6-hour sessions, but it is intended to be done in a single business day. You might also stop because at some point in the process, you learn that there's something missing in terms of what you know, what the group knows, and you want to pause there and kind of go out and conduct a little bit more research, bring a little bit more information back into the session. It could be something about you decide to target a key stakeholder or persona that the group doesn't know much about. So you go out and you spend an afternoon, going onto the street, conducting remote interviews, and then bringing that information back in. If possible, if I do that, or any of the research that I do beforehand, what I always try to do is have printouts. Digital versions are nice, but I always try to bring printouts and visuals into the space and put those up around the walls. And then what happens during and what follows, of course, research is kind of following us along that path. So I'm going to pause in a second to answer some questions. So if you guys do have questions as they've come up, and thank you to the folks that, thanks, Jason. That's a great link for the Cynefin. HBR, Harvard Business Review, wrote a great article on the Cynefin. And I think there's a link to Dave Snowden's video. Let me put that at the top. So David Snowden is the inventor of the Cynefin. And then there's some other really good videos. I'm going to take questions in a sec. So if you have any, start leaving them in the chat. Thanks, Sean. The reason that I'm doing these webinars and talking to so many people and excited about framing is we've been, like I mentioned at the very start, we've been using framing for a few years now. And it's always really interesting to see how I use it versus other people use it. And a lot of the time, I've been doing trainings and workshops, and the questions I would get during training is it's nice that you covered this sort of like canned challenge or something that you're familiar with, some product or service that you use framing on, but I have no idea how to apply it to the work that I'm doing. Do you have, I would get questions about like, can I see the templates you use? Can I see the materials that you organize and bring to the group? How do you structure your time? And I thought about doing more training around how I organize myself, but instead I decided to put all that information inside of a toolkit that we just launched this. It's called the Problem Framing Toolkit. It contains a facilitator's guide. So the guide is meant to be the thing that you keep in your back pocket, the thing that you use to organize yourself. And it has a breakdown of each step, each activity, how to structure your time, why you're doing it, what it's all about, how to run it with a minute-by-minute breakdown of each step within, and then the outcome that you want to achieve at the end of each step and how that feeds into the next thing. So that's facilitator's guide, presentation deck. I'm really in 2020 and in the tail end of 2019, I've been really trying to move away from slides and having visuals and trying to just be more present as a facilitator. But it totally inbounds and totally fair if you like to use slides. So I created a presentation deck. It's all the slides that I've used in my past days of facilitating and using slides. And also, if the team is new to this process, it's always nice to have a visual backdrop so that they can just know what they're doing, where they are in the process, and feel safe that you're taking them in the right direction. They know what to do. They know what to expect. I also recorded a whole bunch of videos. So it's basically everything that I would have said inside of a training workshop. I created bite-sized videos that follow along with the process. And then the digital templates that I've used for years now inside of Mural are also included in the toolkit. I'm working on creating versions to be inside of Miro if you use Miro, but I'm not there yet. So you can learn more at problemframingtoolkit.newhaircut.com. So let me stop and pause and see what kind of questions you guys have. Thanks, Beth. Does your new toolkit detailed agendas for conducting? Yes. Hopefully I answered that, Sean. Yes, it's a total breakdown. It's literally, I just finished the toolkit, designing the toolkit less than a month ago. And I still use, I may not take out the facilitator's guide and use it because I've done it so many times, but all the steps, all the process, all the timing is in the templates. Everything is actually what I use when I conduct framing. So it's basically my stuff and I just made it available. Ruben, what advice do you have about getting the right stakeholders in the pre-work? Great question. So there needs to be, so it's a little bit of a catch-22. So they need to be informed enough about the general direction of the company. So typically what precedes framing, aside from research, is some kind of North Star session or some kind of visioning session, which I also help with, something that sets the year-long strategy for the group or for the entire organization. Some groups use OKRs, others just do like vision sessions, some do moonshots. So some of that needs to indicate and inform who should be in this kind of strategic conversation, because framing is totally strategic. It's about what problems and what opportunities do we want to work on. So that informs you a little bit. What happens though, because when you get in the space, when you get in the workshop itself, you're also talking about more specifically the problems that you want to work through. So you might learn that the group is very excited about this very specific problem space and you need to go and pull one or two more people into it. These people should have enough influence and authority and wherewithal that they can take these conversations and pull the right people from their teams and from the work that they're doing, because you are making a decision. So this group is making a decision that we're going to spend at least a day, perhaps another 2 years working to solve this problem. I do tend to, there's a point, most of the time when I get to step 3 in the process, I do tend to save about 30 minutes to invite executive stakeholders to come and see, hey, we've spent the last hour and a half or so talking about things, and we think we're going to attack this problem. What do you think? Are there any other ideas? What else should we know about this space? I hope that helps, Ruben. Beth, I am intimidated. Yes, of course, you should be. The Cynefin is scary as hell. Beth is intimidated by the Cynefin framework. Could you talk? Well, I could. You and I can also just talk about it one-on-one. I would inform, watch the videos by David, watch the other 2 videos. I need to make a note to share the other 2 videos as well. The biggest pain point or the biggest struggle with running the Cynefin, first of all, you just have to do it and set the expectation that this is going to be hard. Oh, that's another point. In the toolkit, I give a rating of how difficult each activity is, and the Cynefin is I think the one of 2 maybe that I rank as hard or difficult, because you're having these discussions and it's a little bit of abstraction about complexity, and complexity alone and how you define complexity is complex in itself. And then tying those to opportunities that the company wants to work through it's tough. It takes a couple revs, getting familiar with the language and the quadrants, and the fact that people coming from different realms of complexity have different mental models and lexicons of how they define complexity. The biggest place that people fall down when I do the Cynefin is the difference between complicated and complex. I can give you a quick definition. The videos, there's also one video, she does a really fabulous job, and she also gives an explanation of how she uses the Cynefin to do estimates with her engineering teams, which is really cool. But complicated, complex. Complicated is if an example of a complicated problem would be bringing your car in and trying to get the engine fixed, right? The engine light comes on. You and I don't know what we're doing. I just see that the light's on. I'm going to take it to the mechanic. Another one that I like is if you were trying to design a new jet engine, probably not something that you're going to hire me to do, but I can definitely get a group of people together to have that discussion to design Boeing's next, amazing jet engine. But if you also ask me to come and facilitate a session to talk about changing FAA flight regulations of commercial airlines, that's not something that a group of people can just come together and say, what do you know? What do you know? What do you know? It's going to take some probing in the dark, some experimentation, just to know what all the sort of the downstream effects are going to be. And then you can start to attack the space. This is actually where lean and the concept of MVPs came from. The idea that you have to almost build this small, tiny prototype and proof of concept just to understand the space that you're working within, so you can back out and understand how to actually approach it. So if it scares you, you're on the right track, Beth. It is a scary framework, but it's great. It's really, really powerful. How does this align with jobs to be done, David? Well, jobs is, I've used jobs in the past to collect almost in the space of research. So if you remember how I laid out research being kind of interspace between framing and before framing, a lot of the time I would do a process like switch interviews. You can Google switch interviews. It's a way to learn as people move both toward a new solution as well as retreat back to the solutions that they use. So I've used switch interviews that fed and informed for me the jobs that people were interested in solving, and then tied that into the value proposition of sort of the overall stretch for the company and what they were hoping to solve. So it becomes this artifact that feeds into a framing session like that. Dana, do you have exercises for the other 8 steps in your model, like context mapping? Yes. Yes, there are 8 more steps. Each step has an activity. I also have alternative activities for a couple steps, depending on the setup and how you are structured as a team or what you're trying to get out of it. So yes, if I didn't answer your question by just saying yes, just keep going and I'll try to answer more. Do you also cover some of the Cynefin framework? Looking for more. Yes. Yes. So when I get to step 2, my video breaks down in full how I look at Cynefin and how I use it in framing. And then I also have links and resources to Dave Snowden and other things that I've used to learn the Cynefin. Sean, what role or team would be best positioned to lead one of these workshops? I'm a lead UXer who usually collaborates with a director of product on things like UX Canvas. Well, okay, so it of course it depends. It depends on some of the folks on this call or interested in framing don't live in the product world, but even if you're a service designer or business designer, the UX person tends to be that sort of in between voice of the customer. So you'll have people from like sales and operations and customer success, and then you have people from technology and product and implementation teams. And the UX folks are always great folks, either researchers or people that are actually designing some of the UX wireframes and prototypes. Those tend to be my go-tos that I use, just like I use a UXer in a design sprint. Those tend to be the people that I call on if needed to visualize any of the ideas and capture them. Those are also the people that I tend to use or tap if I need extra help with research and going out and talking with people, expertise and people outside of the group. But as far as who best to lead these workshops, a facilitator is becoming a role in companies, which is pretty cool and also probably confusing. I'm a software engineer turned product manager, and now I facilitate conversations. And not being a designer has hindered me in some ways, and so I've had to catch up using a lot of the tools that designers use day in and day out. But also because I have a product and engineering background, I also know where conversations eventually land, at least when it's technology-enabled innovation. So I know some of the feasibility constraints and estimates and just things like that engineers tend to be thinking about. And I bring that into the conversation. So really, anyone can be a facilitator because you're going to bring your own specific expertise to the conversation. And then it's your job to pull the expertise of the rest of the team. And that's why it's also your job to make sure you have the right folks around you. Is it safe to say that problem framing is really ensuring? Well, I'll say this. Before framing, we probably ran, I don't know, 20 sprints. And I think 3 of them were a bit of a disaster. And that had come with us interviewing the client team, going through their research, going through their case studies, going through their investor presentations if they were early stage companies, and really doing what we thought to be our best bet to audit that they were ready for a sprint. And in all 3 of those instances, we did everything that we could have done, and we still got into the sprint and realized that there was either not a problem to be solved there, or a problem that was not going to either tie back to what was important to the company, or that any of their consumers or users cared so much about. So it has helped. Is it bulletproof? Of course not. But it has helped, because the biggest pain point going into something like a sprint, like I mentioned before, is that ambiguity of the challenge that you're there to solve and think through. Holy crap, lots of questions. Sean, I've used kind of, I don't think that's a question because there's no question mark. If there is, let me know. Sorry, Sean. Hey, Douglas. See you next week. Has your process been used for organizational change? By the way, anyone on the call, if you haven't signed up to come to Control the Room in Austin next week, you totally should be there. Not just because I'm going to be there, but because Douglas puts on a great event, and there's going to be a whole bunch of great facilitators and learning. Nice. Let's see. David Todd, has your process been used? Has your process been used for organizational change initiatives? Wow, this is a great question. Or organizational design problems as opposed? Yes, it totally has. And like Beth, it scares the ever-living shit out of me because I'm an engineer and come from the product world, but also because what is a prototype when you move away from product, or when you're not doing foam boards and things like that, as it's a demonstrated consumer service, what does it look like? But yes, it has happened. I can't talk specifically, but I can answer your question. Yes, I have used it in an organizational change capacity. I've used it for really big, hairy human problems, just like worldly human problems. I just ran a sprint in DC with Kai Haley, and that was amazing. It really stretched the bounds of framing important problems and bringing groups of people together to decide how they wanted to push a conversation forward that would affect the whole world. So it can be used. Hey, Serene. Have you run into any issues adding a problem framing session onto the design sprint process for selling? Yes, always, in fact. Every time, so the program that I run inside New Haircut is the core is a 4-week program. It has some team dynamic component to it at the very early stage. It has framing in it, it has research, it has multiple sprints most of the time. And so every time that I described framing for the first time to a group, even UXers and researchers and designers, 9 times out of 10, they say, like, we already did all that. We don't need to do that. We already figured that out. We've been looking at this for a while. And then I look at their research, and it's like one survey and a weird spreadsheet and a couple interviews that really don't relate or don't even go deep into the problem space itself. So yes, Serene, I definitely always get pushback. What I always tell people is it's a day to make sure that we don't waste a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And it's really important, because even though I'm not the expert, I never claim to be an expert. I don't even like to use the word consultant. I'd rather be called like a facilitator or a coach. It is my job to make sure that you're having the right conversations. And framing allows that seed to make sure that the people in the room feel committed to it. I've had many times where I had degrees of sprint failure just because 2 or 3 people checked out because they're like, I don't know why I'm here. So making sure that you have the right people in the room, even if that's the only thing you get out of framing, is still really important, because you need that team committed and engaged throughout the sprint and whatever follows. Let's see. Yes. You're welcome, Douglas. All sorts of pitching. Cool. Well, I don't see any more questions. I'm not going anywhere, though. The last thing I want to share with you guys, the other thing that I do is I run a program with Daniel Stillman. If you don't know who he is, you should also come to Austin. Daniel's going to put on a workshop, I think, before and after the main conference. He is the gold standard of facilitation. He and I created a program called the ILA Program. It stands for Innovation Leadership Accelerator. It's a program that we wish we both had as we were coming up as leaders, as innovators, as facilitators. We teach, it's a leadership development program, but it's built on the foundation of facilitation and coaching and design thinking. It's a 12-week long program. The next one is running, it starts at the end of February, and applications are open until February 14th, Valentine's Day. So if you want to sign up and learn more, go to ilaprogram.com. And if you have questions about the toolkit or anything that we covered today, I really would like to hear how you guys are using framing and questions you have about it, how you're applying it. If you do decide to use the toolkit, I really, like any good design thinker, I really need to continue to learn what's working, what's not. So I'd like to hear from you as well. And with that, I give you back 4-ish minutes of your day. Thank you so much for doing this and being here with me. Thank you so much, everybody.